I mean, I have to be honest, I do. But that said, I don't think it's like it's not a cliff, right? I think it's like, I think it's definitely a definitive moment, but, like a lot of folks say, it's been around a long time and it really has. Um, but I do think it's at a point where something needs to change, you know, um, and it's tough to hear it. Like I said, I'm going to echo what Chad Fuller said yesterday. Like, I'm not against running dogs. I'm not against hound hunting. I love animals. I love hunting, and I respect everybody's ability to hunt. But at the same time, I'm going to be 100% honest that I'll bring an outsider's perspective here. That I do see both sides. And on one side, I see a lot of private property owners, landowners who are frustrated. I think a lot of things over time have built up and caused some frustrations that have led to a point where I would have to say if something doesn't change, I think change is going to be forced on the community, and I don't think that's what anybody really wants. Um, and a lot of it boils down to, it's right. It's like it's hunters' right to hunt versus, private landowners' property rights. And it's a tough issue because you want both sides to win. And I think Chad made a great point last night, which somewhere there's got to be a middle ground solution. And what that looks like is one side's going to be unhappy because they're not going to get everything they want, and the other side's going to be unhappy because they're not going to get everything they want. But that's usually the good sign of a good compromise. But I think, unfortunately, I just don't know how that conversation happens.
Well, that conversation that Chad was talking about compromise, that is one that he and I had before the podcast. We actually talked on the phone for at least an hour, a couple of days before we did the podcast. I think he was kind of feeling me out to see if he wanted to come on screen with me, and I was feeling him out to make sure he wasn't crazy. And we decided that was good. But that compromise thing is something he and I talked about. And compromise, in true compromise, neither side gets exactly what they want. If nobody's happy at the end of it, compromise occurred. So you said nobody wants to see hound hunting disappear, and the community's not really doing itself any favors.
Yeah.
What do you see hunters doing today that concerns you the most? And
Well,
what could they change immediately? And let me say something for the people watching. I hunt with dogs. I grew up hunting with dogs. I took my first deer with a 410 shotgun in front of dogs. I was 5 years old. I got the picture. It's on my page. We have family farm. We have some property we own. We have some property we lease. It's over 10,000 acres that we hunt. I'm not running my dogs all over somebody else. I do have some people in some other seasons that tend to want to hop the fence and come hunt our property. But we're not running dogs all over everybody, and I don't understand the mentality of wanting to do it. I'm gonna let you get back to answering my question.
yeah, I mean, no problem. So I think the first thing I would say is, I guess, to maybe kind of circle back real quick, I'm sure there's actually, to correct one thing you said, I'm sure there's some folks that would actually love to see dog hunting go away, but I'm not one of them, and I wouldn't agree with those folks. As far as me, and I know most sportsmen and hunters I know, we don't want to see it go away. As far as kind of what I see as the issue, so what do they say? The first step to solving as a problem is admitting you got a problem. And I think as a community, as a society, I think we know there's a problem, but I don't necessarily know that everybody's really come to terms with the reality of it or the root cause of it. So, so I think some of it is just kind of coming to terms with the problem. So I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that there's kind of, when you look at Virginia, North Carolina, just South Carolina, just these three states, right? Just because those are the ones I'm familiar with. I know there's dog hunting and, Georgia, Alabama, a few other states, Mississippi, it's an issue down there too, but I can't really speak to that. But, the legislation, the meetings and stuff like that, it's not coming about for no reason at all. Nobody's just picking on the community for no reason. And we all know what it is. It's a trespass issue or a nuisance issue, I guess is probably a way to put it, because there's a technical argument there over whether dogs can actually trespass, right? But that's an interesting legal question that we can get in. get into because it varies by state. But so what I would say is, you've got to understand the problem, and then I think that what the bigger issue is that there's a rhetoric problem. And I realize, like, not, especially on social media, there's plenty of bots and stuff like that. But, when you look at it as a whole, and I even noticed it yesterday. Is it Seth that was on there yesterday, or somebody else? You
talking about the other person that joined us?
Yeah.
You're asking the guy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, I don't think it was him. Orange. Yeah, that's right. Steven. Yeah, Steven. Yeah. So, again, even just kind of listen to a couple of things he was saying. Even the folks that I would consider moderate, or the folks that have kind of realized that, there's an issue we got to solve. When I listen to them, I kind of hear some of the things they say, and I'm like, I mean, you get it, but you kind of don't. Like, a lot of times what I hear is excuses why you can't keep your dogs off other people's property. I hear some blame shifting, like, there was a conversation about folks that buy a small parcel right next to a game land or something, and like, I get it, but at the same time, like, everybody has a right to kind of keep whoever they want off their property, just because, and again, like, even though I see it both sides, pointing it out as an argument, I don't think helps your argument, because at the end of the day, when the points you're bringing up in your defense kind of mirror the rhetoric, or the rhetoric mirrors the criticisms against the sport, and the biggest one is the nuisance, the trespass. I think you just got to get away from you got to get away from defending it. I think that's the bigger one. And the other thing too is, I think we can all agree the biggest issue is there's a small number of bad apples, bad actors out there that just kind of ruin it for everybody else. But I think relying on that and kind of it just makes it seem disingenuous. It's a problem that affects the entire community. And when you see folks that say, well, it's those guys, not me, or it's this, it really feels dismissive. And it makes you question whether or not they really understand the issue. So I think, we talk about a compromise and what that win looks like. I think there's some well-intentioned folks in the dog hunting community that are going to have to, come to terms with the conversation that really needs to happen. And, for lack of better words, they're going to have to offer some solid solutions, and they're going to have to give up some of the, what might be valid points, but just don't sound great. It's just not great rhetoric to defend the nuisance or the trespass.
Well, I'm gonna say something here. I'm not saying it to defend the nuisance, but I'm going to take a comment from the comment section. You and I can't see them in this screen that we're in, but I got another screen here where I can see them. It looks like B. Welkels. Excuse me, I don't have my glasses on and it's a little blurry. Says, I'm an outsider here in West Virginia. We can't run deer with dogs, but we can run bear and bobcat, fox, pretty much everything else. The compromise I've suggested is to close the still hunting season when dog season's in. He says, in our case, bow season would open late September and muzzle loader would open November, and bear season would open alone in December. Technically, in Virginia, you don't have the right to keep people off your property. Technically, in Virginia, you don't have the right to keep people off your property. Virginia has a very strict right to retrieve. I see where he's going with that. Right to retrieve law, and they're probably the most dog-friendly state there is. Arkansas also has a right to retrieve law.
And so does Virginia.
Yeah, he said Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to say with that, Mississippi and Alabama in that area, their dog hunting season is only about 22 days. In North Carolina, we've got 2.5 months. And then we've got rabbit and small game season. We've actually got from October to the last day of February to run dogs. And then we can fox hunt 24/7, 365. So you can run a dog in North Carolina any day. You can wake up, take your dog, go run your dog. So the Mississippi and Alabama place, I've interviewed their hound organizations. And when they told me their season was only 22 days, I nearly fell out of my chair because they've negotiated down to only having 22 days and people still aren't happy. They're still wanting to take the 22 days away from them. And it's one of them. I don't remember if it's Alabama or if it's Mississippi. There's one of those two states there that they have a something they call recovery, and it's trackers, but it's not what I'm a tracker, and it's not what I do as a tracker. Their idea of a tracker is what I call deer hunting. They release 2 or 3 dogs, 4 dogs on a deer that's been shot to track the deer down. And they're not running them on leash, they're running them on GPS collars. But that, believe it or not, is not the part they're arguing about. That's fine. Everybody's cool with that because the person that's still hunting has shot the deer and they're trying to recover their deer. So, bring us 4 or 5 dogs and turn loose, and that's cool. But the people that are jumping the deer from scratch get 22 days and they're trying to take those 22 days away from them. And I nearly fell out of my chair when I heard that. I was like, you've got to be kidding me.
And so certainly take some of it with a grain of salt, and then as far as the folks that are threatening dogs, like again, like the dog is the last thing in the world I'd ever blame on any of this. Like I said, I love dogs, got 6 running around this house, and I know most dog hunters, the vast majority love their dogs. And all that rhetoric, I would agree is just completely unacceptable, kind of circling back, I think to one thing, you kind of use the analogy of the racetrack and the nuisance. Currently I live in the middle of nowhere. I can't even see a neighbor, which is good. And I can, we got a good spot out here, but not that long ago, we lived in a neighborhood, and behind us there was land that was owned by the neighborhood. And then there was a river, and then on the other side of the river, there was a guy over there. He ran beagles, so he was always running dogs, doing a lot of rabbit hunting. And then of course, like a lot of hunters do outside of the season, shooting and stuff like that. So within the neighborhood, very similar. A lot of people got, worked up. They didn't like the noise, they didn't like the barking, they didn't like the shooting. And I found myself, even then, long before I ever even dreamt to, kind of stepping onto a podcast and talking about this issue, defending like, hey, you got to understand, you're living in rural North Carolina. So I certainly understand that, when it's come to barking, stuff like that. Yeah, it can be a nuisance, but I do agree there. And point taken on, buying property out there. I think you certainly have to, understand, read the room, right? You buy property in rural North Carolina. You buy an acre or small parcel up against a lot of, game land, public land, large tract where people hunt. You certainly accept it. That said, I guess 2 points. One is I don't think, there should be an expectation that anybody should have to tolerate, trespass or nuisance. I think there's got to be an understanding both ways. And you've done a good job articulating this, that it happens once or twice. It's an accident. Can't punish people for accidents. And I think, that's kind of the compromise that, out here, I just, like I said, I get dogs passing through. I don't think anybody's trying to do it on purpose. Certainly not going to punish the dog. The dog works its way through. Everything's fine. I get a little irritated when my ducks get run off, or, I've had 1 or 2 hunts, where, you don't see nothing for the rest of the morning, but it is what it is. But, but on that same token, I think that's kind of the compromise on one side, but the compromise on the other is I think there's still got to be an understanding that, you can't expect them to talk, there shouldn't be an expectation that, well, you should just expect it and put up with it. That shouldn't be the going in position. I think we can agree to accept accidents. And then I think my second point on that is, and I guess this is really where it is, to me, property rights are equal. Don't matter whether you own a quarter acre or a 250,000 acres. Our property rights are equal. We all have the same rights. So I think one thing, and this is kind of where I circle back to I think the tough part on the rhetoric is that, I think we got to be careful when we start singling out people, like people that own small tracts of land. And again, you called me on it, and it's a good point. A lot of guys that run dogs are landowners too, so it's landowners, not necessarily a distinction. But if the rhetoric kind of singles out a certain group as, it's tough, that's where I get a little iffy about it. Because again, that guy with 1 acre or 2 acres or 22 acres right next to the WMA down in South Carolina, or right next to a game land here in North Carolina, he's got the same property rights as the guy who owns 10,000. And, so neither one of them should be expected to put up with it, whether it's nuisance or whatever, so I think that's kind of my points on that. And at the end of the day, the compromise we talked about, the compromise, yeah, I think in an ideal world is where you've got a hunting community that, for them, it's that the goal is like, zero, right? Ideally. And it's for both sides, and both sides will, you know, um, both sides will accept, an accident here or there, but I think it's got to be in good faith. Um, and I think,
You
and that,
said two words there that are really important, Josh. Good faith. It's got to be in good faith.
mhm.
Let me circle back, and I'm going to tell you, I could argue either side of this argument. I mean, I could argue it as a pro, or I could argue it as against. I could debate it either way. But I'm going to the the statement that I've made, and you hit on it a little bit, is if you turn your dog loose and it occasionally gets on your neighbor's property, it's an accident, and we shouldn't punish accidents. But if every time you turn loose, it's on your neighbor's property and stays there half a day, or even if it's just running through, that's a habit, and it's a bad habit, and it's a habit that nobody should tolerate. Now, the small property owner, anybody that's sending me text messages and stuff, I'm not going to answer you until after the podcast is over. If you got something to tell me, pop into the comments and do it. Don't send me a message, because I'm not going to read it. I just had 2 or 3 pop up. I'm sorry. I had to change it. I've seen that small property be the problem over the past 12 years. Just about every case that somebody's called me about, it's been a small property that it centers around. And sometimes it's the dog hunter with the small property. And sometimes it's the dog hunter with 20, 30,000 acres and somebody next to them with a small property. But it's always the person, and you can find my writings on this, it's always the person hunting the postage stamp where you start having the trouble. And it could be on either side. They could be the dogs, the people with the dogs turning the dogs loose on a half acre or 10 acres or whatever they got, and the rest of the block's 500 acres, and they don't have permission to be on any of it. Well, them dogs are going on everybody else's property. That's what's going to happen. That's not right. I've never said it was. I've been quoted as saying it was, but it's not. People remember all kinds of things that you never said, right?
Exactly.
I've also said that the biggest problem we got in the world is not paw prints and broken twigs. It really isn't. But do I think, and I had to ask myself this question: do I think that I have the right? And I said right. Do I think that I have the right to be on your land without your permission? And the answer is no, I don't. I don't think so. And I don't want you to be inconvenienced by me, because all that does is make you mad. And then we're neighbors and we don't get along. And that's not the right thing to do. So how do we fix it? And what do we do to work together? There's a club that I've talked to that's put up, that's fenced in almost 5,000 acres. They got a fence all the way around their property to try and keep the dogs in their property. And they've got a little road where they can get around it. Now that's a good way to get in there and stop the dogs. Do accidents happen? Yes, and we don't punish accidents. So there was a couple people in the comments last night that, well, I think they wanted capital punishment if a dog looked at their property. And that's not reasonable. And you can't have conversations with people that are not reasonable. And you cannot negotiate and you cannot compromise with people that do not believe you have a right to exist. You agree with that?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that.
How long were you in Marsac?
My last 3 years I was there.
You got into some aggressive negotiations?
Well, I retired out of the schoolhouse, but yeah, so I wasn't in any of the Raider battalions, but yeah, certainly in those areas, bunch of type A's, you're going to get in some aggressive negotiations. But yeah, I certainly know what you're talking about, and it's when you start from positions of absolute, there's not going to be any room for compromise. I think the counterpoint to that I would offer is I do see a little bit of that out of at least some on the other side from the dog hunt community. There's a lot of folks that will voraciously assert their right to hunt with their traditions, and I so I do think it goes both ways, and quite honestly that probably gets down to the nexus of the issue. You got some folks that don't believe they have a right to exist, and you got some other folks that believe that their right is should be unfettered, and everybody else's property rights be damned. And I think those two positions, and this is going to be an unpopular thing to say though, but I'll say it from a legal perspective. Even though those are two polar opposites, only one of them is legally defensible. The person, however unreasonable they are, that is asserting their absolute right to keep people off their property is legally correct, at least in North Carolina. It varies by state, right? Because Virginia, you've got a right to retrieve. On the other side, he's probably got a lot of points, but legally, he doesn't have that right. He's got, a lot of other things on his side, and he has an absolute right to be heard and compromise and to hunt. But if his position is that his right to hunt includes to do however he pleases, then that's not gonna. That's obviously that's a dog that ain't gonna hunt, right? So what I would say is I think those two positions are unhelpful, but I think that's really the nexus of the argument, right? You've got one side that, regardless of how unreasonable they want to be, they're legally correct, and I think that's might be why we're seeing some of this kind of over time, this erosion, where you've got one side that the law's on their side, and I think that is why, if for no other reason, I think if something doesn't change, we talked about a crossroad. If something doesn't change, I think there's a real risk of this potentially going away. If for no other reason than that, you've got one side that's on the right side of right, and another side that's got tradition and a whole lot of steam, but they're fighting a losing battle if they can't, find a way to compromise, and if they can't change, and that change has got to be community wide.
Yeah, I get that. The comment section. Our same commenter says, I own property and I continue to buy property. And the way I've put it to my neighbors is, yes, I agree. If you don't want the dogs there, that's fine. But don't ever think that you're coming on my side of the fence. Now, I'm going to elaborate on what he said there. I told you that we have a lot of acreage and we have people that we are near. Some of them are hunters and some of them are not. There's people that don't want us on their property that don't hunt. And we make every effort. We endeavor to stay away from them. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
And we've got people that are around us that do hunt. So if you hunt and your property borders our property, one of our family members or board members is going to go to you and have a talk with you. And we're going to offer to let you get in the truck and we're going to take you around the property with all the roads and all the access to everything. We're going to take you around the property and show you around. And then we're going to make you an offer that's a really good offer. And I think that if you were my neighbor, you would take it. You might not, but I think you would. We're going to say, hey, Josh, you got 20 acres that's on our property line. if you can forgive a dog going on your property occasionally, we're not going to go to your property and turn the dogs loose. Matter of fact, we're probably not even going to turn them loose near your property. But if you can forgive one coming over there every once in a while, we're going to write you a club pass for the whole year to have access to this 10,000 acres. You put up a stand, you can get all the deer you want. You want a duck hunt? We got a pond over there. You want a turkey hunt? We got turkeys. You can use it just like it's yours, as long as we have that agreement. Do you think that's reasonable?
Yeah, I think that's a compromise. I do think that's reasonable. And I think that's exactly the type of compromise we should all endeavor for, with one caveat, right? And it goes back to what you said, which is it's got to be in good faith. So you just got to make sure that if them dogs are showing up on my property, that it is just, it's that accident, right? That you didn't turn them loose, all that. But I think because we've got an agreement, and as long as I think the relationship continues in good faith the way we discussed it, I think we're all good. But I also think a key there is you didn't, you started off on the right foot. And the unfortunate part there is I think we've gotten so far down the road in some places that some places it's probably the conversation, it's beyond the ability to have it, right? There's some places, y'all were talking about it last night, some folks, there's some property owners just won't come to the table, and I think those are folks though that, they could just be the types that don't like it, but they could also be the folks that have kind of felt like they've been that there's been a pattern, and they don't believe that there can be any sort of good faith conversation. So but getting back to yours, I mean, I think that's absolutely the right way to handle it, and hell, if someone, I don't really know around here who's running dogs, but if they were to stop in and actually have a discussion about it, I'm sure there'd be something to work out. But I think that highlights, the, there's middle ground for those that want to work together in good faith. I think at the end of the day, we all want to coexist, but we all got to know that that's actually what we want to do. And that's what we're all working towards.
So what does reasonable control mean when we talk about the dog needs to be under reasonable control? What's reasonable? What does it mean? And what's your opinion, and what would be the legal standard? I mean, you're the legal expert in this conversation. I'm just a redneck.
Sure. Well, how about I'll start with the legal standard. So, and it's kind of funny. I actually looked into this today. So we actually talked earlier today about does a dog have the capacity to trespass? Because we throw around a couple words. Trespass is the word that's most commonly thrown around, but trespass. Well, can a dog trespass? Well, the answer is generally no. But nuisance gets thrown around. That's actually probably a little bit more legally correct for for dogs. However, I was looking at this earlier today. I had to refresh my memory because I knew it was there. There's a case. It goes all the way back in 1954 called Peg v. Gray. It's a North Carolina Supreme Court case that kind of had to do with pet dogs, but in there they made a finding or a holding that is to this day actually it's still what they call good law. So it's common law. It's not statute, but it's considered good law. And basically what it says, in fact, here, I'll just pull it up and read it so I don't butcher it. So they were talking about domestic dogs, but they said the rule is different where a dog owner or keeper for the purpose of sport intentionally sends a dog on the lands of another, or releases a dog or pack of dogs with knowledge, whether actual or constructive, that it or they will likely go on the lands of another or others in pursuit of game. In such cases, the true rule would seem to be that the owner or keeper, in the absence of permission to hunt, is liable for trespass. So basically what that says is it actually, in North Carolina, we have law that essentially makes a hunter potentially liable for trespass if their dogs get on there. Now, there's an artful conversation there about, what is with knowledge, actual or constructive, that it will likely go. So I'm going to put on my lawyer hat. And because, we're having an interesting conversation, I mean, you can argue the hunter side, but I'll argue the legal side, which is one, because it gets to the point you asked about with, reasonable control, right? So I would say these are dogs that are bred to chase game, and that and they're going to do it till they either die or they get called off, right? Because in most cases they ain't stopping. That's what they're bred to do. It's what they love to do. You know, depending on, so it's going to be very fact specific. So if you're on 100 acres, you're pretty much guaranteed to know that they're going to end up on somebody else's land unless you can stop them. Even 10,000 acres, right? Eventually, if you let them run long enough, if you don't stop them, they're going to end up on somebody else's land, because as long as that deer's running, they're going to keep running. So there's an interesting, argument that just by the nature of running dogs, that's likely to happen. Add into it, if it's happened once or twice before, even accidents, like, hey, I've got this a couple dogs, they know where a hole in the fence is. Collars tend to crap out. A couple dogs, after a while, they'll just kind of wander off and go. That would be actual knowledge that your dog's going to wander off. So there's actually room in there for that. Now, that said, I don't know how often this case law has been used to actually charge a hunter with trespass, but it's interesting to know it, because they don't have it in South Carolina, although they're working towards it. They've got, you guys talked about it, the renegade statute. They've got that. And then actually, though, last year there was an AG advisory opinion where they were actually trying to extend hunters, basically hunter liability for trespass to their dogs. And the AG basically came back and said, we tend to agree. However, you need to prosecute a test case, before we'll actually weigh in on it. Virginia's different. They've actually got a right to retrieve, which is a whole other, bag of issues, but it circles us back to reasonable control. So for me, reasonable obviously isn't perfect. It's not zero defect. It's not, you got to be perfect every single time. But for me, reasonable is, if you're going to run dogs, you've got to have both the capability and the ability, because those are different. Those are different things. The capability and the ability to stop them if you need to. And I think most hunters would say, they don't want their dogs crossing roads. So I think most hunters would strive to have that ability to stop their dogs from crossing the road. So that would typically mean that you've got the capability, you've got the ability to do it. So the other half of that reasonable control is a willingness, so you've got to have the ability to call your dogs off and the willingness to do it. So, if you're a hunter and you see them heading for some land that ain't yours, sometimes you might need to call them off. Now, you're running 6-8 dogs, and you're able to successfully call off 4 or 6 of them, and 2 of them just ain't listening. I mean, that's reasonable. I get it. I think there's a room for reasonableness in that conversation. But again, it can't be a habit, right? So I would say that next time around, you've got to, hedge your bets. Maybe don't run those 2 dogs. Maybe do something a little different. Try, because at that point, it happens once, okay, it happens twice, all right, but it happens 3, 4, 5 times. It's no longer an accident. So I think you're kind of getting away from reasonable control. So that would be my answer in a long roundabout way, both incorporating law and kind of an understanding into it.
So, from the comments section, getting ahead of the dogs and stopping as a race is realistic in the flatlands. In the mountains, our dogs can run across a holler and be on somebody else, and it's an hour drive for us. That is a good point. And I think Josh just addressed it. I think you just addressed it just now. We got another comment that says, you don't know who's running dogs because it's Western NC. They're bear dogs, and I've had bear run 10 to 15 miles before they tree. That's a running bear. I bear hunt in the flatlands. I ain't never had one run 10 or 15 miles, but I'm not saying it happens.
Yeah, I will say we actually ain't got no bear around here, so they're not running bear. they're either folks
Fox or coyote.
Could be. It could be. Like I said, I ain't never stopped one of them or found one of the runners to find out. But I'm just saying, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some good old boys running deer around here. But it is what it is. So
we're going to be hypothetical for a minute. Josh and I are neighbors. We share a property line, and there's a big old buck that I've got him on trail camera, and Josh has got him on trail camera. we know for a fact he's using both properties. So I get a notice from my trail camera at 6 o'clock on Saturday morning that started calling him Big Boy. That Big Boy is at my food plot on my side of that property line. So I go up in there and I try and get after old Big Boy. So I back up to the property line. I'm about 100 yards off the property line, maybe 101 yards, maybe 99 yards, but I'm about 100 yards off the property line. I back my truck right down in the ditch. I drop my tailgate and I turn loose 10 long-legged Walker hounds, 2 years old, full of it, wide open, to go chase down old Big Boy. Is that reasonable, Josh?
I mean, it depends. If you got him patterned, you know which way he's going to go. I mean, I would say if you know that he's, as soon as you turn them dogs, if he's going to make a beeline to that property line 100 yards away, that's not reasonable.
I don't think it's reasonable regardless of where he's going.
Yeah. And
that close to the property line.
Yeah. And that, and that's the other part, now again, if you're in the middle of 10,000 acres, reasonable, but yeah, right off a property line, especially, if it's a small, hell, even if it's 20 or 30 acres, but yeah, I mean, I would also argue if you've got them on your food plot and you can get get that close to them to turn the dogs, you should probably be working some other way rather than turning the dogs on them. But that's just,
let me tell you what's going to happen when you turn 10 of those dogs loose like that. Maybe one of them is going to find Big Boy, and maybe 2 or 3 of them are going to stick together. But out of those 10 dogs you turn loose out of that truck right there, you're probably going to jump 3 or 4 different deer, and they're going to go 5 or 6 different directions. So the point I was making was right close to the property line, turning loose dogs that you're going to free cast. That's not reasonable. Now take the same scenario. How many dogs did I have? 10?
Yeah, you said 10.
All right. I take 10 beagles and I'm going to rabbit hunt that day. I'm the same 100 yards from the property line. Beagles hunt close. Beagles hunting close. That could be reasonable. The point I'm making is that arbitrary numbers don't really mean much. Reasonable does. You've mentioned property rights several times. Should somebody else be able to tell me what I can do on my property?
No. Nope. I definitely believe in that. Just like somebody can't, just like I believe, somebody can't tell you whether you can or can't hunt. You shouldn't be able to tell somebody what they can or can't do with their property. And I think that's the entire nexus of this issue. You got a right to run dogs, at least for now in North Carolina during the season, as long as you're following the laws. And they got a right to keep you off their property. And that's the whole problem in a nutshell.
So my commenter in the comment section, calling dogs is cool, but with bear dogs, our dogs are a lot of times miles away. The person that keeps commenting, I just want to let you know that I bear hunt with dogs. Joshua's bear hunted with dogs too. I mean, I actively bear hunt with dogs. If you go to my page, you'll see several pictures of us with bears, with the dogs. There's some from last year. We took a bear Christmas Eve last year. So I understand bear hunting with dogs. Trust me, I get it. I understand it. What we're discussing today is property rights.
Yeah, and it's yeah, and to that, like it's right. It's balancing it's balancing property rights with the responsibilities of hunting. Just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean you get to do it however you want to do it. And the realities of whether you're running dogs on bear or deer, yeah, you're going to be miles away from them sometimes. But that doesn't alleviate you from the responsibility of that reasonable control. You kind of gotta, if you're going to do it, you got to do it reasonable. And again, I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but I think that's where a lot of times it comes in. Happens a couple times, but this isn't an issue that's a big nothing burger. It's obviously happening enough, and so you got to sort through the chaff. Sure, you got some folks that just don't like hunting, and maybe they're making a lot of noise about nothing. But I think at the end of the day, if it weren't really a problem, I don't think we'd be kind of in the spot we're in. So I think we've got to view it from that position, right, where you've got a right to do something, but you've got to do it reasonably, um, and you have a responsibility to kind of, for lack of better words, going back, I don't know, like it was for you in the military, the phrase "figure it out." I mean, it's tough love, and it's tough to hear that, when you've got something that you want to do. But I mean, this is a tough love moment. Sorry guys, it's a tough spot. Figure it out. You've got a responsibility to do it reasonably. And you've also got to accept a little risk. I know one thing that came up yesterday that I kind of somebody was asking them down in South Carolina, would it make the problem easier if we had a right to retrieve? And Chad had a great answer to it, which is, no, that actually, property rights are property rights. You can't just give a right to retrieve. And my thought, kind of a follow up to it, was, that there's got to be a little bit of some acceptance of risk on the hunter's part, because if you allowed just unfettered hunt without, with no potential risk, which is, potentially, losing your dog on some property overnight or whatever, and there's no risk of that, then what motivation do you have to do it reasonably? So there's got to be a little risk, a little potential for pain involved. Again, within reason, right? Don't hurt the dogs. We're not doing that. But as a hunter, you've got to, maybe have some long nights trying to figure out how to get your dog back if you're not going to exercise that reasonable control. And I think that's part of that reasonable compromise we've really got to come to grips with. I think if we can get to that point, there's some common ground here, but it's not as common sense isn't always a common virtue, I guess. I don't know. I'm not sure why that's an unpopular take, but from an outsider perspective, that's kind of the way I look at it.
So I got some feedback from last night, most of it positive, and feedback from both sides of this argument. And like I say, most of it was positive. But I had one particular one that sticks out in my mind. And the person said, well, if that guy came in and bought that property right next to 10,000 acres, he's the one causing the problem. And I stopped and thought about that for a minute. And well, he's the one that's bringing up the problem, but is he the one that's actually causing it? That's what I asked myself. And I don't think it's unreasonable for somebody to say, I bought this property, I own it, and I really don't want my neighbor messing with it. That's not unreasonable it might not be neighborly, it might not be friendly, but it's not unreasonable, and it is the law. And I had somebody say, what's the difference between somebody's hunting dog and a bobcat or a coyote or something?
Yeah.
Chasing
that one too. Yeah.
chasing your deer. Well, the difference is one's domesticated and one's not, and one's supposed to be under control of the owner and the other's not.
Yep. Yeah, that last point's the key there.
Yeah, I get it, Josh. Trust me, I get it. I just don't want, and my position's been for 12 years, don't punish a mistake, and don't let your mistake turn into a habit. My position's never changed. I've said the same thing the whole time. So if you were put in charge of writing the rules tomorrow,
How would
and your rules were to make sure that 50 years from now, hunting with hounds still existed, what would you do?
Man, well, I mean, there's a part of me that would just want to take everybody and lock them all in a room and nobody comes out till y'all solve it. But that ain't a constructive solution. That's old school rules. So I think what you've got to do is you've got to attach consequences, right? So you've got to, one, assert. Well, actually, I can make a good pivot to something else you brought up. You brought up that constitutional amendment that North Carolina did. What was that, 2018, about, asserting a right to hunt tradition. I took a read at it, and I think it's great, and it obviously enshrined it. But there was a couple things in there from a lawyer perspective that jumped out at me. One, they ended it by stating, that it doesn't amend property rights, or any of that. It doesn't amend any trespass or property rights law. And I think that's important to know, that the state enshrined your constitutional right to hunt, but they also enshrined the laws that are already on the books. So you've got to understand that the state views those equal. And the other one is they reserve the right for the General Assembly and North Carolina Wildlife, WRC, to regulate it, right? So they said, hey, you got a right to hunt, but we can regulate it. So kind of circling back to that, I think what everybody has to understand is, that the solution is in the middle. That I think if we can start from a point of truly respecting the property rights of landowners, not diminishing, just starting from a point of respecting them, and not saying zero defect, and then come up with a way to reward hunters that do it the right way. And for, that reward may be simply not punishing them, but quite honestly, you've got to find a way to truly punish. Well, I hate the word punish, but it is punish the bad actors, the folks that are the serial nuisance, the ones that are really the problem. Beyond that, again, it's going to sound like a little bit of a cop out, but I would honestly ask the hunters themselves, like, what's the best way to do it? I think I made a suggestion one time, like, hey, if and again, so I say a trespass, but like, what's that really mean? How do you really quantify an issue, right? Like, what's the difference between a mistake? So I think you've got to find a way, and on the spot, I probably can't do it very well, but how do you quantify a punishable offense? But let's say we did it. You lose your hunting privileges for a year the first time, and then the second time you lose them for 2, the third time you lose them for 5, and after your 3 strikes, you're out. And I think that's probably something both sides could get behind. I think the folks that do it the right way would want something, even though that seems a little extreme, to put some teeth on it for the folks that ain't doing it the right way and are kind of ruining it for everybody else. I think the tougher problem is how do you define that? And I'm going to be honest, even I struggle with that one. I mean, how do you define the difference between a mistake and doing it in bad faith? And that's really, I think, where the rubber meets the road on that issue. I think what I will say, I think Chad he made a good point, which is, right now, I think at least under the North Carolina has several levels of trespass. There's the criminal trespass, there's civil trespass, and there's actually a hunting trespass. That's kind of on, the wildlife folks to enforce. You put it on the landowners. Go through an investigative process. See what it is. Do a legal standard, elements, intent, the whole 9 yards might be a way to do it. But that's probably where I get stuck. I know I'm starting to spin my wheels here, so I'm just gonna kind of hand it back over to you at that point. I don't know if any of that made sense.
I get you. Well, most laws do require intent. There's some that do not, but most laws do require intent. In North Carolina, trespass, you have to give due notice. You have to give notice that you're not supposed to be there. And if the land's not posted and you're on it and the owner doesn't want you there, they have to tell you to leave, and they have to give you the opportunity to leave.
Yep.
And if you don't, then it becomes criminal trespass. So I actually wrote an article about this. Hey, Chad.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, Chad.
How'd the meeting?
Hey, it's a pleasure to meet, even if it's virtually.
Yeah, you too, buddy.
How was the meeting tonight, Chad?
Unfortunately, I had to leave a little bit earlier. My wife has had some blood pressure issues, And, so I needed to get back home. So I'm kind of down here in my man cave right now. We've gotten those blood pressure issues resolved. And she's resting. I'm going to look forward to a report. I got there about 4:30 today. I actually had some people talk to me about the podcast last night, which was kind of nice. I think that dialogue, I did listen to you guys on the drive back here. And all very, very excellent, well put points. And I think it's amazing for having this platform, and thank Joshua for coming on, and everything else too. He's hit the nail on the head more times than I probably did.
Well, I would say the same about you. You're a bit more eloquent on a few things, but yeah.
Chad, did you have people come see you tonight from both sides of the spectrum?
Actually, I did, and it was nice. And I will say, it's amazing from the houndsman's perspective how many people were there. I definitely had some whispers and some looks. I think if looks could kill, I'd been dead 10 times over. But I had a few people that were very nice that came up. And it opens that dialogue. And that was, it was good. It was good. Once again, I did not stay for the totality of the meeting, which, I did want to get up and testify, but at the same time, I've also got to be respectful too, to let everybody else voice their opinion, to DNR before these, quote unquote recommendations come out. So, if somebody hasn't had an opportunity to speak, obviously I'm speaking loud, and sometimes you don't necessarily need to be the loudest voice in the room to, effectuate change.
So somebody said last night, that Chad Fuller guy is well spoken. I said, he's an attorney. That's his job. He has to be well spoken. He has to be well written. That's what he does for a living. He basically writes books every day. They're called motions.
To be fair, my paralegals write most of those, and I just polish them up a little bit, to be honest with you. But yeah, that's and law clerks and things like that. So, but yeah, I mean, I get to take authorship of it. So I had to do the same thing coming up as well. It's kind of like going through baseball, double A, triple A, and majors.
Gotcha. So, since you're here, I'm going to hit you with a question. Well, this question was specifically written for Joshua, so I can't ask you that one. You never served in the military, did you, Chad?
No, sir. I did not.
All right, so I can't ask you that question.
Well, and to be fair, I don't want to steal Joshua's thunder. When I had commented, I just said that Joshua's got some great points, and he's hitting the nail on the head, kind of like where the crossroads of this problem is. It's come to that pimple popping point, and we got to figure out what's going to be done to make all of us, compromise.
All right, well, this is a Chad question. You mentioned South Carolina may eventually pursue a test case arguing that hounds are legally an extension of the hunter. If that happens, how significant could that decision be for hunters throughout the Southeast? And I'm going to add one more thing. I know people that hunt on the side of major highways, and it seems like that 99.999% of the time, the dogs get caught before they get on those big, major, busy highways. So with that, I'm going to let you answer my question.
Okay, so in relation to that, the test cases, and there's a possibility, you got to have a plan B, plan A, plan C, when it comes to, how we tackle this problem. The more the pendulum swings to the light, the darker the shadow it casts. And so from that standpoint, we're trying to reach that compromise position. I do not have any problems, and nor does anybody in my organization have any problems with hunters setting up on the road to catch their dogs. I think that's reasonable. That is prudent. It is certainly, going to be something that needs to happen from a public, welfare standpoint and a safety standpoint. You know, you don't want dogs crossing through. You don't want, you know, deer crossing through as well, which they do without the presence of dogs anyway. However, you know, if you're going to set up on that roadway, and we talked about it a little bit last night, I like the idea of registering a property and actually having signs put up on those right of ways to make everybody aware, just like, you know, men at work or construction zones, things like that, that, hey, you know, dogs could be in this, you know, area. And I think from that standpoint, that would be good. But, you know, to actually make it law would be different. And, you know, remember, there's different ways to affect law. There's, you know, you got legislative change and you got judicial change. You know, Josh has already hit on that a couple points tonight, as far as what good precedent or good law is. You know, and that can change. I mean, sometimes a dissenting opinion and a judicial opinion can be the next law that comes out from a court's ruling. It's an organic, you know, growth process that happens in nature to law. You know, and sometimes even with, and I think a lot of people forget, you know, kind of the schoolhouse rocks thing about how all the executive, legislative, and judicial branches work. I'm a bill. If anybody's watched Schoolhouse Rocks, I'm a bill is a great example, because they could pass a bad bill that is still an unlawful taking from the judicial branch side. That's why our forefathers had the great insight to create those checks and balances. So even if the legislature, even if we do whatever we do on our Property Protection Alliance side, passes something or is successful to get it through the Senate, the House, to the governor, and it gets signed into law, you know what? You know, the dog organizations are going to have the same opportunity in court to say maybe that's an unlawful taking. And then, you know, this whole process starts back over.
We were talking briefly just before you came in about right to retrieve, and I said that initially when we were working on the Landowner Protection Act back many years ago now, over a decade ago, that I was initially in favor of a right to retrieve. And the more that I've dealt with stuff, don't get me wrong, I think I still want to be able to go get a dog. But the more I've dealt with it, the more I realize that people, I'm trying to think of the right way to say it. They tend to take advantage of things, and they don't take as much care when it's the same argument as, well, my dogs can't read, so that's why they're on Josh's properties, because they can't read. Well, they can't read. But by the way, the dogs in my children's books can read. So if they're on your property, you invited them. But, you know, dogs can't read, so therefore I can let the dogs go anywhere they want to. And I get that that's causing serious problems for everybody. I have people tell me, well, it's just people being greedy because they've named their deer and they've got 20 acres and they got Jimothy and Big Boy and everything else, and they're upset if you shoot their deer. Maybe that's the case. If you got 20 acres, odds are those deer aren't using that 20 acres their entire life anyway. They're ranging off that 20 acres. So, and I'm smart enough to realize that, and most people are. But people want to throw around arbitrary numbers, like you can't run dogs on less than 1,000 acres. And for the people watching, I'm not saying that I support that, because I've been misquoted recently about that. I'm not saying I support it. I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm saying I'm having a discussion. But if we're going to throw around arbitrary numbers and you're going to tell me that I can't do something on my property, then we're going to talk about what you can't do on your property. So if I can't have dogs on 999 acres, then we're going to talk about other management processes, such as food plots and trail cameras and other things that affect the movement of the deer. I've had people say, well, my corn pile doesn't get up and run around and disturb people. No, you're right, it doesn't, but it does interrupt the natural movement of the game. So I feel like I've got an argument there that if we want to talk arbitrary numbers, that whatever number you want to apply to dogs, we're going to go ahead and apply it to your food plot and your trail cameras and everything else. I got 2 attorneys looking at me. So we got 2 attorneys and a redneck. So y'all address the redneck's concern.
We might have 3 rednecks, just for the record, even though we got 2 attorneys. I'm just throwing that out there.
Duly noted, and I concur.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
If we're going to apply arbitrary numbers, like I can't run dogs on less than 1,000 acres, that the same would apply to all management properties, such as trail cameras, food plot, corn piles, because they do affect the movement of the herd. They affect the natural resource. Period.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a valid argument. Yeah, I mean, the point, yeah, where do you draw that line, I guess, would be the primary issue with that, and I would tend to agree. I had to think through that for a second, because well, I will. Okay, here's your counterpoint. This was the one my hamster took a little bit to get going on the wheel to put this one together. The one thing I will offer is, at the end of the day, the issue between the two is running how many acres you can run, or how many acres you need to run your dogs. Really, at the end of the day, has less to do with what you can do on your own land, with the risk to other people's property. But when you start talking about the other side of that, which trail cameras, food plot, the nexus of that is what you're getting down to, is what somebody can actually do with their own property. So there is that distinction that I would make. However, the point is a valid one. You're, at the end of the day, you're basically talking about hunting methods, and a duly noted. And it's also worth noting that trail cameras and baiting are already, contentious issues. So we're really just adding fuel to the fire by kind of folding into another contentious issue. And oh, by the way, what's that?
I want to interrupt you, Joshua.
No, you're good.
Josh, I'm not saying that they can't have a food plot, and they can't have a bait station, and they can't have a trail camera, because it's their property. If they want to have that on there, they're not saying I can't have a dog on my property, right? What I am saying is that they can't take the natural resource that belongs to the state using those management abilities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, I
By
definitely.
the way, for anybody watching, I'm not even suggesting that we do this. We're having a hypothetical conversation. Go ahead, John.
Well, to jump in on that hypothetical conversation, I think one of the things that you're getting at, Todd, and Joshua, you being a property lawyer, know as well as I do what an attractive nuisance is. So therefore, if I'm going to put my devil's advocate hat on, and say, okay, well, if you're baiting, and I've certainly heard this from, some of the opposition as to what we're trying to accomplish, is, okay, well, you guys are I guess, quote unquote, growing the deer, and creating these food plots or corn or whatever else. So, that's enticing the deer to come onto your property and enticing the dogs to come onto my property. But what I would say, in relation to that, is it's still our property. We can do what we want to with it. And, if I want to grow sunflowers or, whatever else, I could do that. But yeah, and there's some legitimate points, not to get into a bunch of it, but, big corn piles, you got chronic wasting disease is a huge problem across America right now. I mean, when you get your deer tags here in South Carolina, there's going to be a little note on it talking about chronic wasting disease. I can see where corn piles could be an issue later on, things like that, because if the whole herd is coming to one particular area, that creates an environment where, disease can spread. So are you creating what would you call an attractive nuisance? There's a potential for that. And if you want the corresponding acreage, that would obviously have to be, legislated, just like we're trying to legislate this issue.
Mm-hmm. I know a good, another little hypothetical though, and it's actually we're losing the plot just a little bit, but I mean, what's the difference between a food plot and a bait pile though, right? It's like you got a guy who owns 2 acres and he's got a half-acre garden. could be a food plot. You know, he could set up a tree stand 25 yards away, 10 yards off his back porch, you know, and he pulls them in, you know, but that's a whole other philosophical argument between bait piles and food plots and all that. But
well, I'm actually not proposing that we do it. I'm just doing it as a thought process, you know. And I've had people tell me, well, my food plot doesn't run around and disturb people, but it's not about the food plot. It's about the deer herd. It's about the game that doesn't belong to anybody. So it's a valid argument. I think it could be argued either way. I think I could give you two the decision. Okay, Chad, you're for, Josh, you're against, and I think we could have a fantastic debate about this, and I could be the judge.
Well, one thing I do want to point out too, while I was there tonight in Orangeburg, they're you know, once again, we're not against deer dog hunting or driving it at all. Especially that was, you know, one of the few speakers that I did get to hear before I had to leave. Talked about, you know, the effect it has on his crop. I mean, everything he grows is straight from his crop. Once again, we don't care what happens on your property, and for that, I mean, I think deer dog hunting is a huge tool and an asset to, you know, make sure that deprivation of your crop and stuff like that, you know, doesn't happen. You know, so from that standpoint, that farmer has every right to use his property and whatever method to protect his crop within obviously the regulations of SCDNR. And you know, that's, you know, there's some very good points coming from these conversations and listening to some of the farmers and things like that. But it still stems from, you do you on your property, I do me on my property.
yeah.
I'm all for that.
Kind of circling back to, you know, and I know you brought it up as a hypothetical, and nobody's advocating for like a minimum acreage or whatever to be able to run dogs. But to caveat the point, you know, I would argue it's less about the acreage and more about your ability to control your dogs. You know, you might have folks that they might be able to run them on 500, and if you got good control, then you're good. You might have somebody that's hunting them on 10,000, but they can't stop their dogs, nor do they care to, and they may be a bigger problem than somebody else. So, you know, I think at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to: is you got, you know, hunters, you got a right to do something, but you've got an obligation to do it responsibly. You've got to have the capability, the ability, and the willingness to hunt your dogs properly. To stop them, you know, you'll do it to keep them from crossing the road. You'll set up you know, folks on the ground or a picket line on the road to make sure they don't do it, but you won't do it for a property line. You know, again, assuming that you could actually do it for the property line. I realize there's some much more complex issues at play there, but you know, but that's at the end of the day the point. And I think if we could get to a middle ground like that, where there was that good faith understanding that me as a property owner, I might tolerate an accident here or there if I know that in good faith you're trying to hunt your dog's responsibility and have that reasonable control. There might be middle ground. Unfortunately, you know, the rhetoric, the talking points don't always line up. You know, I think sometimes it's just people getting hot-headed and emotional, which I totally get. But you know, there are a large number of folks out there that are just they're stuck in their ways, you know, and I think those are probably the ones that are going to be, you got to work harder to get them to come around, because I think that's what's got to happen to find middle ground on this issue.
So Chad, you mentioned the farmers their crops just getting hammered and using whatever management techniques they needed or depredation techniques. You've hunted, you served in the military, and now you're practicing law. Looking beyond the legal arguments, what do you think has changed in rural America that has made the conflicts between hunters and landowners more common than they were 5, 10, 30, or 40 years ago? When I was growing up, there were not any conflict. Well, let me change that. In every community, there was one guy that didn't want you to look at his house or anything. There was only one guy though, and they were few and far between. So what do you think's changed? Todd and I did this question last night. If you guys want to put a bow on it, I'll let each one of you say something and then we'll call it a night.
Yeah, I'm good. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Like I said, when I first sat down, I was honestly kind of wondering what in the world I was doing here. I just kind of stumbled my way into a topic that is even though I'm not knee deep in running dogs, I'm neck deep in hunting. So it's part of the world I love and believe in. So I'm happy to participate. I'm glad, for the opportunity to contribute to it. Um, and hopefully, I'm sure Facebook will keep me plugged in and keep involved, but I do hope here before too long we can, sort something out. I don't think anybody really wants to see this thing go away. So, but I think as long as folks like you and Chad and everybody continue to stay involved, I think we'll get there.
One question I got for you, Josh. Have you ever hunted deer with dogs, on a big property?
So I have never hunted deer with dogs. So I don't own a big enough property to do it. I'm not saying I wouldn't. I've just never had the opportunity to do it. I've run bear, but never deer.
I'm looking at your schedule in November.
I will take a look at it.
And Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, we're going to pick a day, and you're going to come see me, and we're going to go hunt deer on 10,000 acres with a pack of dogs. And I'm going to let you experience it for yourself. Does that sound like a deal?
That sounds like a deal. I'm in.
They had the same option. I told him we're going to do the same thing.
Yep.
So I want you to experience it. I've taken famous country singers. I've taken a couple of politicians, and I've taken a red politician and a blue politician. So I don't play favorite teams. You know what I mean? But I want you to come. I want you to come try it. I have another saying that I do is don't hate what you don't understand. And I'm not saying that you hate, but I'm just saying don't hate what you don't understand. So I want you to come do it, and we're going to do some filming, and we're going to make you famous. But no, we won't do any of that. But I'm going to expect a lot from you being a MARSOC Marine. I'm going to expect you to be able to shoot.
Okay.
I was actually going to queue up a reel I told Chad about yesterday. We tried to play it yesterday, and the screen went crazy of me taking a deer at about 500 yards that was running in front of dogs.
Shit.
So I'm going to expect a little bit from you. I'd probably bring a shotgun too, just in case. But
I got plenty of those.
So Chad, you got something to say before we close it up?
No, I mean, I'm sorry I kind of came and crashed the party. But Josh, I did listen on the drive back here. And spot on all the legal analysis. I think that was great. Todd, thank you for having the opportunity, and I hope this is a conversation that can continue forward in the future. It's obviously something that we're all very passionate about, and just remember we're passionate, but maybe we need to be passionate with compassion.
I may try and set something up to where I can have some panelists. Like last night, we had a guy that coon hunts in that talked with us briefly, and I'm trying to set up some panelists with maybe a couple of different types of houndsmen, and maybe find at least one that's an absolutist, and maybe have some discussion, have a moderator. I'd love to have a neutral moderator. I'd love to have a retired judge be a neutral moderator that doesn't hunt. That would be fantastic. I'll take a retired police officer that doesn't hunt too. But I mean, I'd like to have somebody that's capable. That's a trained observer that's capable of being impartial, and just have a chat and see what happens. But that's sort of something I'd like to do. I've wanted to do sort of a virtual fire barrel talk, and some of the guys do something similar, and that's where guys that hunt, fish, trap, whatever, enjoy outdoors, just sit around the glow of the computer screen instead of the fire barrel and tell their stories and talk like we've done the last 30 minutes or so of the show tonight. We've talked about hunting New Zealand, and we've talked about hunting Idaho, and I think we might have talked about Colorado briefly. But that stuff's interesting to people, and it's common ground. You can't find anybody out there that hunts that wouldn't want to sit down and talk to you about your New Zealand hunt. It's common ground. I went to a Christian college. I went to North Carolina Wesleyan, and one of the classes I had to take to graduate was overview of religions, and I learned something that I didn't know. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, all three trace back to Abraham.
Mhm.
So all three of these major religions have common ground in Abraham. And that is something that stuck with me for a while, that you got to find common ground to have conversations. And I'm not going to go down a big religious thing this deep into it, but so that's what I got, guys. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you taking the opportunity to talk with us. I feel like we've made some progress. I think that we've opened some eyes at the bare minimum, that people are approachable and people can be talked to. And the people in the comment section need to take a step back and just quit being so nasty. I don't understand. I don't under. I do understand why you do it, being an intelligence operative myself, but I don't understand the mentality of the average person creating a burner profile just so they can get online and be nasty to their neighbor. Having actually died for about 15 minutes and being out of body, I sat there and looked at my body and I was like, I didn't think about, I wish I had argued with strangers on the internet more. That did not cross my mind. I knew I was dead. I could see my body in the car. I knew I was dead. I knew I wasn't in it anymore. And I didn't know if I was ever coming back. But I can assure you, arguing with strangers on the internet did not cross my mind. I wish I had done it more. I can tell you that I did think about my grandchildren. I thought about my family, but I wasn't concerned about arguing with people. It wasn't anywhere in my view. So maybe we need to live like we're dying. Thanks, guys.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll do it again soon.
Yes, sir.
And folks, that's it. Good night. We will see you on the next one.